This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
It is 7:17. You're listening to the evening edition with Sharmilla and Lynn. And now we're moving on to news that has come out from the World Bank. They've just revised our forecast of our GDP growth from 6% down to 4.5%. So we're looking into what this means and how a lower GDP would impact our economic recovery.
So I don't think that any of the reasons behind this is going to be a surprise, right? So the spike in COVID-19, for example, is very much at the heart of it. COVID-19 in general sits in the middle. And some of the main reasons behind that is that our recent rise in cases raised concerns around our healthcare capacity. The slow rollout of the vaccination program has also been a concern. And also related, of course, to the lockdown are the effects of opening and closing of our economy and the ability to do business and how that's impacted households and I think everyone as a whole.
And I think this is compounded by the fact that the pace of that recovery isn't something that we can actually put a specific timeline on. It will entirely depend on the length and severity of our movement restrictions. It will depend on how effective our pandemic measures are. It will also depend on that rollout of vaccinations and how quickly we can get our people vaccinated. So all of this to say, I think that 6% that was initially projected isn't really looking doable anymore. And what we wanted to discuss was what that means. What does that mean in terms of Malaysia's economic recovery and what we could be doing? What sorts of policies do we have to have in place to basically deal with this as it comes along? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You can call us 77332900, WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio. We are now joined by Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO for the Center for Market Education. Carmelo, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good evening.
So could you explain in layperson's terms what this revision of our GDP means?
Well, first of all, we can explain very briefly how GDP is calculated. So GDP is summing up every year for a certain economy, private investment, private consumption, government expenditures, and the difference between export and import. So both Bank Negara and the World Bank predicted a growth of our GDP in 2021 when compared to 2020. So when we look at these figures, we are trying to guess or to estimate how bigger or smaller will be the summing up of these components this year when compared with the past year. So initially there was the prediction that in 2021 the GDP could have grown of 6%. Now this prediction has been revised down to 4.5%. This means that the economy is expected still to recover when compared to last year, but at a slower pace. My take is that this prediction is still over-optimistic given the current conditions. But just to answer your first question, this is how I would explain in simple terms what has happened today.
And so if we look at this revision then of the initial prediction from 6% to 4.5%, you've mentioned the different things that would go into this calculation. Could you walk us through perhaps how this number was arrived at and also why you think that it might still be an overstatement?
Well, we should ask the World Bank first, but of course, depends very much on your baseline. So I think that if it was me to do this prediction, the first consideration I would do is, can we consider, let's say, the COVID emergency finish? Yes, no, or at what extent? The second one I would ask is, are we going to reopen borders internally and internationally? Yes or no? Because the way in which we answer to these questions will very much affect how all the figures will be affected. I think that the revision that came in is given basically by the fact that private investments are anyhow in a declining trend since a long time in Malaysia. Domestic consumption, private consumption will remain weak because movement restrictions are bringing more people into unemployment, underemployment, and even for those that still can maintain a higher power spending, let's say top managers in multinational companies, but if all the shops are closed, you have power spending that you cannot flood in the market. And second and third, sorry, still the power spending of the government is weak, is limited. The fiscal space for government is still very limited, and probably the only positive expectations that we can have now is on the export, because most of the Malaysian manufacturing companies are authorized to operate, but they produce things that are not in demand in the local market, so they must look for markets overseas.
Now, the Bank Negara is also expected to revise its initial projections. They initially projected 6 to 7.5% growth. Why is it important that they have a realistic forecast?
I think, the forecast somehow, again, is a forecast, and we keep on revising these forecasts, help us to direct our action, is a signal somehow. And be overly optimistic is also not good, because it gives an impression that you are somehow playing with the numbers just to give a positive number. So we need to have, for business purposes, I think in particular, is important to have realistic and adequate signals to understand where you are going. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think having also a foot into the business environment, working a lot with multinational companies, and living the reality of business every day, I think that there is a very much depressed business mood. And if we look at general conditions of the economy in this moment, Asia is the continent that is bringing less opportunities to business, because there is a tougher round of movement restrictions. In Europe, everything is more or less back to normal. We don't know for how long. We don't know if vaccination will be finally the answer to this, or if there will be the new variants, or we will need to revaccinate. So in October, we will have, I think, a much clearer picture. But in this moment, international business in Asia is on the suffering mood, and we cannot expect really positive numbers very soon. And actually, since last October, I was used to say that we are going to experience a reverse square root recovery path, which means that after the big drop of the first part of last year, we have a physiological rebound after the opening, and afterwards the economy will remain more or less flat for a period of time that now is difficult to predict. But we are still, I believe, into that flat trajectory, and therefore to expect something more than 2% for this year, given the current circumstances, is pretty much unrealistic, according to me.
So there has been a lot of emphasis on the need for the government to recalibrate spending. Could you talk to us about this and what you think should be done?
The government has spent somehow quite a lot, but my question is if the spending was in the right direction. And at the beginning, you mentioned the possibility of our healthcare system to hold the stress of rising number of infections. And I think that is precisely where we missed the target. We have spent 15 months without getting ready for the situation to get worse. Probably we have been too optimistic in this. And all at sudden, COVID hit Malaysia seriously, like hit Europe and United States last year, and we have been caught unprepared. So I think that if we want really to develop a serious strategy to fight COVID in Malaysia, and I tend to say that the one that was presented 2 weeks ago is not a strategy, it's just a wait and see. A real strategy cannot do without strengthening the healthcare system. We may observe even rising cases, and actually I'm an advocate for rising the number of infections rather than reducing, if we want to get rid faster of the pandemic. But we need to get targeted infections, and in order to to get that, we need to have a stronger healthcare system. So I think that the only spending that makes sense today is spending in healthcare and research.
So speaking of that spending, how can the government balance between this decrease in revenue, but an increase in spending and even borrowing?
Yeah, of course, this is complicated. And I think, as I mentioned, that much of the spending has been done in the wrong direction and has been forced by questionable movement restrictions. But I believe that if a signal is sent that the spending is going in the right direction, to strengthen the Malaysian economy and to strengthen our capacity of hold another COVID crisis eventually, investors will accept that and will be more keen to eventually lend money to the government, and will be even probably more interest from domestic investors to support the government in this effort.
As you rightly point out, other parts of the world are beginning to open up, are beginning to make their way towards economic normalcy, recovery. Will this have a positive knock-on effect on us, especially if things continue as they are?
Yeah, it will be, as I mentioned earlier, I think that Malaysia should look at overseas markets, because there's no way that the domestic market will go to help the economy this year. So the positive mood in the West should be taken as an opportunity for our manufacturing companies to explore more aggressively those markets.
Carmelo, we just have about a minute left. Just looking beyond the pandemic, what measures can we expect as we move towards economic recovery?
I think that the best that we can do, and actually I'm coming up with a very long paper, I think 100 pages, on an anti-COVID plan for Malaysia in a couple of weeks. I think the gold standard for this strategy would be to liberalize rapid test kit in order to allow businesses and schools to adopt a massive strategy of what I call mass, frequent, and affordable testing. This way, we will be able to have early detections and therefore avoid the development of heavy symptoms in most of the patients, and think that we can imagine that we can handle the pandemic, allowing the economic recovery that we very much need in this moment.
Carmelo, thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
That was Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO at the Center for Market Education, speaking to us about the revision of our GDP by the World Bank, lowering the projected GDP, really. And we'd love to hear from you. You can call us 77332900, WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio. And coming up after this on Popcorn Culture, we're dedicating the entire show to animation. So keep it here on the evening edition, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my, BFM 89.9, the business station.